Even in a galactic scale war, soldiers don't spend all their time fighting. The enlisted beings of the Grand Army of the Republic, Imperial Military, and Alliance to Restore the Republic spent much of the Clone Wars and Galactic Civil War back in their barracks or forward bases, awaiting combat or redeployment. In Star Wars The Clone Wars, we got a few glimpses of how clone troopers spent this time. On Coruscant, they had an entire bar that pretty much just serviced the GAR. That begs the question of what else they did in their spare time, and how it compared to the activities enjoyed by soldiers in other major galactic armies. In this video, we'll be answering that question.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Let's start with the Grand Army of the Republic. Early in the Clone Wars, the men of the GAR spent all their spare time in the barracks with little to do. The clones were, of course, the fully owned slaves of the Republic, and the Republic treated them like it, paying little thought to their needs beyond the bare minimum to keep them alive and in good condition. Indeed, the Republic was much more concerned with keeping off-duty clones separate from the civilian population, as the Kaminoans had cautioned them to, and for good reason. This is because, as we've discussed in the past, the clones of the GAR weren't sterile. Apparently, the Kaminoans had found that sterilizing human clones had numerous adverse effects on combat performance, and so they created an army of 10-year-olds with the bodies and hormones of genetically enhanced 20-year-old men. The Kaminoans feared, and not without reason, that an army of horny clone man-children could seriously impact local genetic diversity if allowed to freely mingle with civilian populations. In the interest of avoiding one-night stands and other complications, the Kaminoans advised the Republic to completely separate the clones from the civilian populace. This meant that, in the early war, clones spent their off time cooped up in their bases with nothing to do. But that changed midway through the Clone Wars thanks to the intervention of Cal Skirata. Skirata was one of the Mandalorians Jango Fett had brought in to help train the Republic's clone commandos, and he became deeply attached to the clones under his care. It bothered him quite a bit that the clones would never get to have lives beyond military service, and this ultimately led him to lobby the Senate into loosening up the restrictions imposed on off-duty clones. Thanks to Skirata, the Republic eventually allowed clones to leave their barracks during their time off. We're sure many children were born with a suspicious resemblance to Jango Fett as a result, though the genetic diversity crisis feared by the Kaminoans never came about. Beyond that, this loosening of restrictions allowed clones to visit local bars, get hammered, and terrorize loyalist worlds with their drunken antics. Some bars were frequented enough by off-duty clones that they developed a reputation for being clone bars, as exemplified by 79s on Coruscant. These sorts of takeovers were unofficial. 79s, for example, still catered to non-clone clients. But many in the Republic were uncomfortable around the clones, who were poorly understood and often feared even by staunch loyalists, so they tended to avoid dives frequented by off-duty troopers. All told, after Skirata's reforms, the clones behaved more or less like you'd expect any other soldier on leave to behave, and they enjoyed more or less the same activities, albeit with greater separation from the general population than was normal. As we all know, the clones of the Grand Army of the Republic became the first stormtroopers after the establishment of the Galactic Empire, but they were steadily phased out by recruited human soldiers. These new recruits were treated differently than the clones, as they weren't slaves, at least on paper. With that said, the Empire was still the Empire, and it still didn't treat its personnel all that well. Stormtroopers especially got shafted pretty badly, though they all absolutely deserved it. Members of the Imperial Stormtrooper Corps were expected to forego all semblance of individuality to become empty vessels for the Emperor's will. As we've discussed in prior videos, the Empire went to great lengths to destroy the Stormtroopers' sense of individuality, forbidding them from using their names and customizing their armor. This conditioning was extremely effective, but it could only go so far. Stormtroopers still knew how to relax when they were off duty, and they often broke regulations to live a little when they were behind friendly lines. On the Death Star, for instance, some of the station's dedicated Stormtrooper units used large, zero-gravity internal shafts left over from the station's construction as impromptu sports arenas, in defiance of orders from their superiors. With that said, it's important to remember that most of the Imperial military was not composed of stormtroopers. The Stormtrooper Corps was an elite branch, comparable to the US Marines, and standard Imperial Army soldiers weren't subjected to nearly as many draconian rules. They were allowed to exist as individuals and all that, and the expectations placed on their shoulders weren't nearly as strict. When off duty, they lived more or less like the clones had after Scarada's reforms. They went out, got drunk, and got friendly with the locals. Of course, with the Empire being the Empire, Imperial military personnel were also allowed to participate in unsavory activities that probably wouldn't have been tolerated under the Rebel Alliance, and probably not under the Republic either. Imperial soldiers stationed on planets where the Empire was actively expropriating and marginalizing indigenous sentient species often spent their free time harassing or even hunting the planet's rightful owners, often with their superiors' overt or implicit permission. As a result of this, off-duty Imperial soldiers were often attacked and killed by angry locals, which is hands down the best way any member of the Imperial military could have spent their free time. Then there was the Alliance to restore the Republic. The Rebel Alliance wasn't really a uniform fighting force, and standards and conditions differed across the Rebels' different cells. For the most part, however, the Rebels didn't get all that much downtime due to the pressures and demands of fighting an all-out galactic revolution, and those that did were usually stationed on hidden Rebel bases or on ships in the Rebel fleet. In any case, off-duty Rebels typically had little to entertain themselves with, as the Rebel fleet was typically kept far from inhabited space, and the Alliance's major bases were usually built on undeveloped worlds with harsh conditions. There wasn't much to do on Yavin 4 or Hoth that was both interesting and safe. On Hoth especially, it was extremely unadvisable to just leave the base unless a mission demanded it. Yavin, at least, was a bit more hospitable than Hoth, if by hospitable you mean thoroughly haunted by the ghosts of the ancient Sith and covered with millennia-old death traps. Even the Rebels' bases weren't all that fun. Echo Base wasn't nearly as cold as the rest of Hoth, but it was still unpleasantly chilly, and Massassi Base on Yavin 4 was haunted by Exar Kun. Kun doesn't seem to have actively messed with the Rebels in any meaningful way, but having the ghost of one of the most evil Sith Lords to ever live walking around is bound to have been unpleasant, even if the Rebels weren't aware of him. The Mon Calamari cruisers in the Rebel fleet had better amenities, but the trade-off for that was that personnel stationed with the fleet had to cope with being cooped up on starships for years on end. Just ask the crew of Battlestar Galactica how much fun that is. The Rebels' superiors were far kinder to their troops than the officers of the Republic or Empire were, but serving in the Rebel Alliance came with prolonged isolation from the galaxy, which is an unpleasant experience for anyone. So, which of these armies had the best recreational activities? Or the least bad, we should say? Well, the answer is none of them. That award goes to the battle droids of the CIS droid army. Unlike the frail organic meat bags of the other three armies, the CIS's battle droids didn't have to put up with boredom or one-night stands or Sith ghosts. When they weren't on duty, they simply folded up into storage racks and shut down. That sounds vastly preferable to the other three options from where we're standing. Anyway, that's just our entirely correct meatbag-free opinion. What's yours? Free to post your thoughts in the comment section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you in the next video.